Are we coming through on my laptop or the owl?
I'm not sure. Would somebody at the, somebody else say something?
I can say something. How's that, Emily?
I think it's the owl, yes. Thank
Okay,
you.
perfect.
Can I ask what the password is for the?
Oh, yes, here you go. Thank you. And let me get you a notepad. There's some pens right next to you. Can I get anyone else anything before the meeting? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dory.
Yeah, Mike will be in momentarily, Emily. I'm not sure if he called you.
Oh,
he ran-
no.
So
Okay.
he'll be like momentarily.
Okay, thanks.
Gonna be here?
Yep.
Oh, okay.
Okay, it's a little past 3 o'clock. I'll call the meeting to order. This is the special board meeting for the Comfort Lake Forest Lake Watershed District. It's Thursday, May 2nd. It's about 3:03. So why don't we start off with the attendance roll call? Doug,
Here,
Manager Anderson,
Here.
Manager Baki,
I am here.
and Manager Schmaltz here. So we have a quorum, and our administrator just came in from traffic, so we're all set to roll here. So the subject today is floodplain vulnerability assessment workshop. So I think we'll turn it over to EOR. Is that correct, Mike?
Yes, I don't know if Emily wants to do a little
Oh, I'm
introduction.
sorry, Emily, go ahead. You wrote the cover letter on the meeting. Why don't you go introduce it?
Well, just some of the background, how we got here.
Yep.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Mr. President Manager. Camilla and I will be kind of jointly given the presentation today. We have a few slides prepared, and we had sent out a worksheet in advance via email. And if anybody would like printed copies of that at the office, let me know, or otherwise you can kind of take notes on your computer, whichever you prefer, or, you know, take notes if you'd like. Just a general intro on the floodplain vulnerability assessment. We are generally looking to build flood resiliency in our watershed. It's definitely a major undertaking to do this and to try to do it in the right approach of the highest cost benefit, as the district's always done. And it's kind of a new era for the district. And, previously the North Star for the district has been these really high levels of phosphorus loading. And we've used the diagnostic study process to target those and make some really good reductions in those. And we're seeing the benefits of that water quality. And so now we're kind of shifting our focus a little bit here and trying to find that new North Star. And maybe it's not just a single one, but triangulating a few. And so we're really going to be looking at priorities here during this workshop and kind of when we talk about floodplain and flood risks, exactly what that means. And we'll get into that. And even just the planning itself, it'll take time, and we're proposing to do it collaboratively with partners and with members of the community. And that'll really strengthen those partnerships and clear the way for implementation down the road as well. And then once we get to the implementation, like these big capital projects, those will take several years to complete as well. So we are a little background on kind of the state of things. And I think I'm preaching to the choir here a little bit, but, we are seeing the impacts of climate change in Minnesota. Here's a few, I pulled some slides from a recent presentation from the University of Minnesota. But we are generally going to be seeing wetter springs, and especially you can see in our area here, 6 to 10% by mid-century, and 35 to 40 to maybe 45% by the end of the century. And in contrast to that, very wet springs, high precipitation events, but then likely going to be seeing drier summers generally throughout our part of the state. And so, again, presenting some data from University of Minnesota, Minnesotans, for the most part, they're concerned, they're aware of this, and they want to see action. In a multitude of areas, there's the mitigation of fossil fuels, and that's one side of things, and then preparing to weather the changes themselves. And that's really kind of what we're talking about with the flood resiliency. And there's strong support that local, state, and municipal governments should be involved in this work. And so, those extreme precipitation events, as we know, going to be having high water overflows, and in fact, wastewater overflows. So even more pollution entering Minnesota's lakes and streams. Flooding could impact roads as well as residential properties. And again, this is data across the state. And generally, Minnesotans are seeing insurance premiums rise as a result of these extreme weather events that we're seeing and projecting.
Say, Emily, I have a quick question. You used the term there on the slide, wastewater overflows. Is that truly wastewater? Or do we mean stormwater or both?
So my understanding is that's like, say, in St. Paul, the wastewater treatment plant. And so, maybe Camilla, would you step in and maybe elaborate on exactly what wastewater entails?
For sure. So if you have combined sewer systems, right? So if you get a bunch of stormwater coming into your combined sewer system, then it taxes the wastewater and that goes directly in. Or some of these may be more rural wastewater treatment facilities, just aren't sized to handle that amount of flow that would come in for a large precipitation event. And so then they also might see overflows to
Okay.
downstream water bodies.
Okay, yeah.
Most of the metro, though, is separated.
Yes.
Forest
it
Lake
is.
was one of the last to have its stormwater separated. And so that happened right around the time the district started.
Mhm.
Yeah, so,
So not a big.
Not in
concern for
Minnesota.
This particular.
but the one in Wyoming, for example, is on an old farm, obviously, that they bought. And it flows really close to the Sunrise River. That's the exit point. And they have the old style out in the environment, open ponds.
Yeah.
And so there's going to be a lot of wastewater with that precipitation coming down and the flow leaving those ponds.
Yeah.
So that's the real problem, like she said. It's more the small communities and the rural areas, and they typically are close to rivers
Mhm.
or streams.
Okay, good, thank you. Mike?
In addition, I do know on that particular topic that it's not uncommon for a lot of utilities to, they struggle with the fact that just in these wetter periods, that homeowners that, may have sump pumps or pumping it into their drain systems, into the waste systems. And so there's a lot of clean water that goes through the whole system that provides an additional taxing element. Some people, they come up with a variety of ways to discharge it away from their homes, and that's not an uncommon one. We have observed that here even locally.
Well, when I first moved up here in 2002, they came around and inspected our house, checking to see where the sump pumps went.
Mhm.
So they were trying to get rid of the water then, back then, still trying to get rid of it, I guess, so. So if people were putting it in their utility tub and then letting it just run into the pipe and out, right? I mean, down into the sources.
Right, so, yeah, it's a statewide issue.
Yeah, and we have such high water tables here that everybody's got a sump pump just about, I think, unless they're up on a hill or something. So.
And so, as a result, adaptation is essential. And, even the University of Minnesota and a lot of organizations recognize that, you might have one primary benefit to a project or an activity, but, you really want to evaluate if there's multiple benefits or co-benefits that could be achieved with the different projects that you might do. And so here's just kind of some examples of, different types of practices and the different sort of, mitigation or adaptation, kind of benefits they would achieve. And, the university, estimates that investing in natural climate solution practices, Minnesotans save or they receive $8.55 in public benefits. So just trying to quantify, savings from a variety of impacts. And as we see, it's more than just maybe flooding out of roads. It's the wastewater, it's residential. There's a lot of different impacts that could occur. And so everybody's role is kind of important here, is understanding how government works together. And so kind of bringing it back to the Comfort Lake Forest Lake Watershed District, obviously our mission is protecting and improving water resources, using adaptive management, and then that component of education of local stakeholders in there too. And so that's kind of a very broad description of sort of how we fit as a cog in the machine here. And so, drilling down a little bit further, some of the district's priorities in the watershed management plan, section 2.3.2, it kind of had primary and secondary issues. Those primary ones being lake water quality, which the district has been working hard on for years now. Stream water quality, which is really closely associated with the lakes, given all the inflows. And floodplain management is, during this last planning cycle, the board said that's one of the primary issues. Wetlands, upland, and groundwater in general were voted as secondary issues, but we know that all of this is so intertwined and related to each other that there's likely going to be wetland, upland, and groundwater benefits achieved, even if your primary driver is flood mitigation. And so those floodplain goals, we had estimated that we need to add 99 acre-feet of storage across the watershed between now and 2031. And then this kind of more broad goal, but really important, is this improving community preparedness and emergency response capacity. Noting that specifically sharing, modeling, and mapping with communities, and we're proposing to kind of take that a step further by doing this process really closely with our partners and community members. And so kind of what we're hoping is the purpose of this floodplain vulnerability assessment is multiple. It'll help figure out where those 99 acre-feet are needed. In some areas, an acre-foot is going to have more of a benefit than other areas, and depending on what benefits exactly you're looking for. Help identify who and how to build community preparedness, who is doing what, who to get in contact with, what kind of mitigation strategies that are going to be the most beneficial to the community. And then we're hoping that through this process, through the community engagement, which we'll get to, kind of building trust within the community, strengthening these partnerships. And at the end of the day, the district kind of serving as that technical resource, that scientific expert in these things. And so there's a lot of areas, a lot of levels of detail here in this work that we're doing, and the district has done some work so far. And so I've got a kind of complicated slide here, but trying to just illustrate all of the stuff that goes into this and exactly what we're talking about here. So, the district started this work maybe 3 or 4 years ago, working with some of our partners in Browns Creek and Carnelian Marine St. Croix, and just trying to get an idea of getting on the same page, making sure we're speaking the same language with that engineering component of, what sort of predictions and what sort of modeling is everyone doing? Are we all on the same page? And we had applied for some grants to further that work, but the district was unsuccessful with those in past years. But we still, in the meantime, dedicated some local resources to doing this flood hazard mapping. And so that is literally just a desktop analysis of where the water collects. So it's kind of the depressions in the landscape. We have this map. And so then in the fall, the board approved the scope for the floodplain vulnerability assessment. And in the meantime, EUR has worked with us, and they have compared where the water collects and who is impacted by that. And I'll go through all the various GIS layers that were used to answer that second part of that. And to get some recommended priorities and rankings, and then that's these that integrated scoring map and all the maps that build into that, which we had posted in a previous board packet, but haven't really presented slide by slide yet. And so the next, after we gain consensus on, yes, these are the priorities, here's how we would rank things. Yes, this map looks good, or we want to change this map, and you tweak a few things and the red areas might drop down to orange, or some yellow areas might pop up orange, or so on and so forth. So refining that scoring and ranking prioritization. And then the next step would be this flood vulnerability modeling. So the district recently invested in updating its hydrologic and hydraulic model, our H&H model, computer model that helps us kind of dig deeper and identify, among other things, what are sort of the choke points in the system, and where are the problem areas really going to be once you see kind of all the dynamics of flow. And it would be very costly to do those analyses across the entire watershed. And so we're recommending kind of a phased process and prioritization to which sub-watersheds we'll do that modeling in, and we'll get to that. And then we're proposing that at that point, when we're still sort of high level here, establishing among ourselves what we think the priorities are, but then bringing that to the community. And, at cities, we've already had some preliminary conversations with city engineers, counties, and, other community members, whether that's, the lake associations or churches or other just kind of groups out there. And having them tell us if they agree with this prioritization, if they disagree, if they think it should change, or if there's something completely else that they say, well, have you thought about this? And so we hope to kind of flesh those things out through this community engagement process, which we'll get to. And then once yes, go ahead.
I'm sorry. When you're done with this slide, I just have a point, but you were going to make another point.
I was going to go on to project ID and ranking, but do you want to say something before that?
No, go ahead.
So then once we're kind of on the same page with these priorities and we look at the modeling, then that next step, kind of this process that we're familiar with the diagnostic study, you gather the data, you run it through the model, and then start to figure out on the landscape what kind of projects you can do, and evaluating the cost benefit and ranking those projects. And then it starts to get into this more familiar territory. If we got a list of projects, using that sort of adaptive management approach, and whether it's, big capital improvement projects, or maybe more collaborative kind of practices, mitigation strategies with partners, using that feedback loop of designing, implementing, monitoring and evaluating, and assessing our progress and seeing, how the landscape is responding to the interventions that we do. Camilla, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, just kind of piggyback on what you've already said, Emily, and maybe just use a couple different words. Like the flood hazard mapping is really like a screening tool, and we didn't really talk about that when we prepared for the meeting, but it's a high level analysis, right? You're using topographic data to say, where in the landscape do you think you'll see flooding? And that screening tool, like we'll talk about, like Emily will talk about on the next series of slides, allows a watershed or a community to stack these other components, like social components or environmental components. So you can say, here's where we think we'll have flooding, and here's where we have some social factors or some environmental factors that we want to be thinking about when we do the modeling work and when we design the solutions. Communities typically say, okay, well, we've got a flooding problem. We know what the solution is. We need a bigger pipe. And then they just put that in without really thinking about all of the potential opportunities, like Emily said, might be there before we go to the bigger pipe. So taking this approach helps the watershed district prioritize and align improvements with your goals, but it also helps you set the stage for the communities to maybe think a little bit differently about how they're evaluating flooding, what flooding even means, and then what the solutions are. So hopefully that provides a little context as well.
Thank you.
If I could,
Sure.
I just wanna adjunct onto that.
Mhm.
Because what struck me in here is, there's no mention of climate. No mention, you know, maybe tangentially, but this is our Greenway project. You know, we've talked about this before, that's the umbrella of it all. It's all wrapped into climate, obviously, resiliency and so forth. And I think when you talk especially about the layers that you have to look at and lay on top of each other, always there and always present should be this climate initiative
Yeah.
that we have, and the Greenway designations that we are trying to get to.
Mhm.
So your inventory, resource inventory, I don't know if that's done yet or not. I don't think I've seen a full report on it. But taking all of those reports that we've done, the H&H you've mentioned here, which is very important, but so is that inventory resource, because to the point that you're making is that there may be a natural solution rather than a mechanical solution
Mhm.
to some of these flooding areas. And what we want to do is protect those natural areas so that we can use them for this higher precipitation that we're all going to be expecting.
Right, that goes
Mhm.
to like the slide that Emily had before, the co-benefit slide, right?
Yes.
If we can say the approach is, we're gonna look at green infrastructure improvement. We're gonna look at protecting our natural assets, recognizing they play a role in stormwater management. And then last, look at the gray infrastructure improvements that are needed. Then you get, if we go right back to that slide, Emily, you get way more benefits, right? You're providing wildlife habitat, you're creating better you're addressing air pollution, you're addressing urban heat island. And then you put your money into
Right,
the pipe upsizing
Maybe
that you might need.
restoring some trees.
Absolutely.
In urban areas,
Yeah.
because the uptake of trees is tremendous. And,
And it makes-
and they're carbon sinks, and so is wetlands. So, you know, we've got all of those things that we need to just constantly have in the forefront, because, I ran across a law that's working its way through, or the bill, is hopefully gonna become law, and I've shared it with Mike, but it is on, climate resiliency funding. And everything in that bill is about climate resiliency. So we need to be always framing, in my opinion, we need to be framing all of these projects in that context.
Yeah, absolutely. And that data that we've gathered, I can find a presentation that we had given on the natural resource inventory. I want to say last year, but I'll find that. And yeah, talking about how we've got this excellent body of data, and so overlaying it and understanding where our priorities are, because you could do projects everywhere, but until you kind of have a solid agreement and a path forward on what is the top priority, it's hard to really begin.
It is, but in support of that, all that data, is that we have information that we can share with our partners. And so it doesn't always have to be the district. It can be, okay, if you do this, you know, we can come in with this type of project. And so you're collaborating that way, but you're also educating our partners in good development practices. And certainly ones that have more climate resiliency
Mhm.
attached to them.
Mhm.
Yeah, absolutely. Good points. So I actually think I will at this point turn it over to Camilla to talk a little bit more about the plain vulnerability assessments.
Thanks, Emily. So one of the things that Emily and I wanted to achieve here is, you know, a lot of people talk about climate change impacts. We use words like mitigation, adaptation, and resilience, and we're not always using the same terminology. So I thought these definitions from the 5th National Climate Assessment, which just came out at the end of last year, would be good to revisit. So on that slide where Emily was showing the co-benefits, some practices are mitigation practices. So they're measures that actually reduce the amount and the rate of future climate change by reducing emissions of heat trapping gases or removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. So one of the green infrastructure practices was a green wall, or putting trees, increasing tree canopy. You're actually taking carbon out of the system. Adaptation is then the process of adjusting to an actual or an expected environmental change and its effects in a way that seeks to moderate harm or exploit beneficial opportunities. So when we talk about flood mitigation, we're not able to get us back to the conditions 50 years ago, right? We won't even be able to get back to conditions today, but we can build a system that allows the communities to bounce back quicker if we didn't take a more resilient adaptive management approach. And then resilience is the ability to prepare for threats and hazards, adapt to changing conditions, and withstand and recover rapidly or more rapidly from adverse conditions and disruptions. So, are there any questions about those definitions?
No, it's good to have a, constant, like you said, definition. So that's gonna be ours, I guess, huh?
Yeah,
Okay.
so like Emily said, adaptation requires collaborating with the communities to identify the goals, to assess vulnerabilities, to improve capacity, and address those contextual factors like values, culture, risk perception, and historic injustices, so that we're sure that the projects that are being put in the ground are equitable and just. Should we go on to the next slide? So flood vulnerability assessments 101, Emily presented very similar information in the previous slides. In 2020, Kenny Blumenfeld came and presented to the Water Consortium. And the overriding message are things are changing, we are getting wetter. And the way that our precipitation events are coming is changing, right? We have more extreme precipitation events, we're having more water delivered quicker, followed by periods of drought. So we have to be able to withstand both of these extremes. And on the bottom, you can see, how much money is being paid by FEMA in these states for these various catastrophic events. So this was a question that the Browns Creek Watershed District, Comfort Lake, Forest Lake, Carnelian Marine St. Croix asked in 2000. We just came out of a very wet period and the district administrators were saying, tell us where the flooding is that we don't know about. Where is the next flooding area going to be? So then we said, well, how do you want to do a flood vulnerability assessment? Because there is no standard process. The American Society of Civil Engineers is just coming out, now with a protocol, but in 2000, that didn't exist. Nor is there a standard process for what types of rainfall events to use to simulate climate change. So we put a technical memo together that said, locally within the Twin Cities or in the state of Minnesota and within the Midwest, what are other engineering firms doing for their clients? And we came up with a number of ways that watershed districts could simulate impacts related to climate change. What do we have on the next slide, Emily? So generally speaking, the approach that we have taken and the approach that others are taking is we've used this topographic analysis or this flood hazard mapping to do this high-level screening tool. Then we look at what are the infrastructure and critical facilities in these more vulnerable parts of a city or a watershed. We also do a social vulnerability assessment to say what areas might be more vulnerable if we layer that on top of the flood hazard layer. And we look at those environmental factors that might be more sensitive to periods of flooding. From that, we can identify priority areas, so we can use the hydrologic and hydraulic model to say, what about this area will be sensitive to flooding? What will flooding look like? And how will it impact these different criteria? And then there's a stakeholder engagement and community input process to see what they think the practices are, what kind of flooding are they experiencing, and what types of practices would they like to see in these areas. And then we identify the types of projects that would alleviate those flood conditions. Again, looking at green infrastructure, looking at natural asset management, and then finally looking at the gray infrastructure improvements that are needed. So on the next slide, I think we just.
May I
wanted
ask a
to-
question?
Absolutely.
Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, going back to that slide we're looking at now, a social vulnerability assessment. Could you elaborate a bit more about that? What is that?
So the social vulnerability assessment, Emily will speak to in more detail, but that's looking at where in the watershed district do you have people who are more vulnerable in terms of income, English as a first language or second language, elderly people, young people, who are the most vulnerable people in the community and who's going to have a harder time responding to flood conditions than other people in the community.
So it would be about perhaps looking at people in poverty and people who lack resources to deal with flooding. Is that part of that as well?
Dave, there's a whole section on this later on. We go through each one, so there's about 4 or 5 slides on this particular topic later on.
But yes.
We'll be getting
that's-
to it.
People with low income are one, that's one of the indicators that we looked at.
Thank you.
Yeah. So before Emily starts in on the assessment, we just wanted to talk a little bit about the differences in these different studies, right? So the reason that we came up with that memo in 2000 was to try and get commonality or kind of standardize the process for all the watershed districts in the East Metro, right? Because you have different communities that straddle different watershed districts. And if one watershed district uses one rainfall event and somebody else uses another, it might be hard for a city to figure out how they want to design their flood improvement projects. So case in point, Rice Creek Watershed District did their flood vulnerability assessment, and they did it differently than we're recommending for the Comfort Lake Forest Lake Watershed District. So I just wanted to highlight these 3 examples just to sort of give you a sense of the differences. So Rice Creek Watershed District identified the locations in the watershed that are vulnerable using their H&H models to map their future conditions floodplain. So they went straight to their modeling and said, where do we have flooding and where do we have storage and where can we potentially do improvements in the landscape? For Comfort Lake Forest Lake, we started with that screening level flood hazard layer. That's the same thing that we did for the city of Rochester. Tried to help the city of Rochester say, where does it look like where is your system most vulnerable to flooding? So they could use that information in the exact same way to prioritize where they wanted to focus their efforts first. For the infrastructural, social, and environmental assessment, this is a screening process to Rice Creek used a screening process to identify wetland areas on public parcels that could be enhanced and public parcels with a low crop productivity rating and proximity to known flooding locations. So their screening process was very specific and looking at where there are opportunities relative to where they have wetlands in the system. Whereas Comfort Lake Forest, like in the city of Rochester, was expanding that to say, where do we have social vulnerability and where do we have infrastructural needs? Where do we have roads that are access roads and other things that you want to take into account? For the hydrologic analysis, Rice Creek Watershed District looked at a number of sources and settled on a generic 19% increase to the 100-year 24-hour rainfall event. And the source of that information was EPA's National Stormwater Calculator. So that's similar to the slide that Emily showed, where she showed the state of Minnesota, and she said there's a 45% increase in Washington County by mid-century. You could just take a 45% increase of the 100-year event and say that's how much rainfall you want to use to simulate what flood conditions would look like in the next 30 years. But what we're recommending and what other engineering firms are doing is using NOAA Atlas 14, which is a very common tool used by the engineering industry, and then using the values on the upper end of the bounds to say for a 100-year event, this is what a maximum rainfall event could look like. And if you take those values for Comfort Lake Forest Lake, Or for the city of Rochester, that equates to about a 33 or 34% increase in precipitation. So you can see that those numbers are a little different, right? 20% to 35%. And then we just talked about, just compared what they're doing for stakeholder engagement and community input. Both Rice Creek and the city of Rochester use this community resilience building framework that was developed by the Nature Conservancy, so that would be very similar. And then the structural and non-structural improvement projects, Rice Creek is looking at capital improvement storage on the landscape in their existing wetland or wet areas. The city of Rochester looked at green infrastructure, natural assets, and storm sewer infrastructure upgrades. And then the Comfort Lake Forest Lake, that's to be determined, but probably in alignment with that greenway.
Yeah, exactly. Going back to that middle one.
Yeah.
The hydrologic analysis. So can we assume then from this answer that Rice Creek could potentially have another 15 or 20% increase that is not factored into this calculation?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know, right? These are projections.
Yeah,
So,
but it's not as accurate as the one that you're using, the NOAA, correct?
well, it's hard to say if it's more accurate or less accurate. It's a
Okay.
different source of information.
Okay.
What I recommend and what has been recommended to me by the University of Minnesota and what I read when I review different
Mhm.
literature sources is there's lots of sources of information for climate change projection.
Mhm.
I think it's best to look at a handful of those.
Mhm.
Look at 19%, look at 34%. Do something different, and then look at the range of what people say could happen and plan for the range versus picking one number and printing a map, and that's what people remember,
Okay.
because that may or may not happen.
Sure.
So it's up to you to decide how you want to do that. When you identify your priority area and you say, this is where we want to look at the model more closely to see what we need to design, then the next question will be, what rainfall events do you want to use? The reason we recommend NOAA Atlas 14 is because NOAA Atlas 15 is being developed, and NOAA Atlas 15 will be looking at climate change projections. They will be taking that into account. So if you stay with the same source of information, it's easier for you to understand, it's easier for the public to understand.
Yeah.
It's easier for everyone. But if you start shifting between this source and that source, and
Mhm.
then it gets confusing, and then people start to lose trust, or even if they don't have trust in the first place,
Mhm.
it's harder to communicate. So, great question.
Well, it's getting harder to deny that there's a climate crisis happening,
Agreed.
you know, and it really just sort of hit us immediately in the last 18 months, I think.
I do, yeah,
And so now it's in front of us. The worst thing we can do is under project. And then we spend all that money doing all this stuff and it's not good enough.
right.
So, you know, I'm kind of leaning obviously toward that NOAA Atlas, especially with the information about 15 coming
Yeah.
out. Yeah,
Yeah,
okay, good.
okay. Mhm. Emily, did you want to cover this slide? Great.
Yeah, so kind of the next, after this slide, I'll be presenting some slides that EOR put together for us, and it really kind of shows the work that's been done to date since the board approved that scope of work. And so kind of understanding all the layers that went into the mapping, and then, you know, really when you look at that final integrated priority map, really knowing what's in there and understanding the recommended priorities that are in there. And either saying, yep, we like that equal ranking of all priorities, or we want to tweak it a little bit, and that might change what that integrated map looks like. And then even after that, you know, taking whichever sub-watersheds from that integrated map and starting to do some of the modeling, discussing the next steps for that, which ones we'd want to start with, because it'd be really costly to do it district-wide right away. And then after that, really, this is the big checkpoint that we want to reach, and then kind of looking at the time where we're at, start talking about what we are proposing for community engagement and, you know, additional board workshops and where we want to go from there. So, there are these 4 categories of, top layers that we looked at. Sorry, I'm just keeping an eye on the chat. Manager Loth has joined. He joined at 3:28. And Chris, that was, Camilla Correll at, from EOR, who was, speaking earlier. She's been the point person from EOR, on the technical work for the flood risk assessment. So gonna go through in a little bit more detail, environmental, social, infrastructural, and then we already kind of touched on that flood hazard piece. And so here are the layers that went into environmental, and I'm gonna go through each one in more detail. So, you know, our impaired water bodies, that was a big item that, you know, the district's been working on, and hopefully you're gonna be taking some of these impaired waters off, but can be sometimes used as a stand-in for, you know, kind of the lakes and streams that are in the worst condition and want to be protected. So scoring that along with these other ones. Looking at native plant communities connected with groundwater, that's a known desktop layer that's out there that the DNR provides. And it could be kind of a stand-in for where, you know, that groundwater interaction is occurring. And also just like good native plant communities that would maybe support kind of habitat in a greenway sort of focus. Soil erosion risk, another layer comes from Board of Water and Soil Resources. Kind of looking, you know, these, we know that soil erosion can have a big impact on the surrounding water bodies. And so that's kind of one of those environmental factors that we want to look at. Of you get a big rain, you have these highly erosive soils, and you have a lot of sediment going into the ditches and streams. And then the 4th one in the environmental factors is the Minnesota Biological Survey, Sites of Biodiversity Significance. And so that's kind of those high quality native plant communities, rare plants, rare animals, things like that. And that's really, this factors in a lot with priorities from grant programs like the Lassard Sam's Outdoor Heritage Fund. They look at that kind of thing. And so here's the resulting map of just the environmental factor, kind of overlaying those layers and the scoring. And so the red is the highest risk, you know, that flooding poses to environmental things like native plant communities and water bodies and highly erosive soil. And looking at the social, this was kind of one of those questions earlier. We'll get to that social vulnerability layer last. But looking at pollution sensitivity of near surface materials. And so that's in the social because of, you know, drinking water quality, private wells, things like that. You know, humans depend on groundwater a lot to thrive. And so looking at where, and those near surface materials being, of course, geologic materials like aquifers. We overlaid the trails and parks, and so what we did was reviewed the park plans of our surrounding cities and counties and looked at their areas of, you know, and it includes city-owned land, existing parks, potential future parks, and this could be a really useful area to work in partnership with the cities and counties. And, you know, they might already have land that they own, like a big open space that could be a good candidate for a project or something like that. And provide those multiple benefits to people so they can get outside and, you know, be educated about the environment too, through maybe signage and things like that. Buildings, and this comes from FEMA, looking at just existing structures, not necessarily critical infrastructure, we'll get to that later, but just looking at, you know, buildings, houses, things like that, that exist. And finally, the social vulnerability layer, which EOR developed for us, they took census data and they looked at things like that of, you know, vulnerable populations, lone parents, young children, people age 75 and older, dense areas of population, renters, people below the poverty line, people without a high school diploma, and people who speak English less than well. And so these were some of those layers. And I'll just note, other watersheds in Rice Creek, for one, they show up in certain areas on the state's environmental justice areas of concern map. You know, the state's done a lot of mapping with these sorts of things, and the really high priority areas show up on that. And so we don't have any of those areas in our district, and so we can't just kind of use that as a stand-in. But that doesn't mean we don't have, you know, such people, even if it isn't to the level that it shows up on, you know, the state's radar. We went and collected the data ourselves and kind of developed our own stand-in for that environmental justice areas of concern. So I want to pause before I move on from social. I know there was questions about this one. Is there any questions or discussion we want to have on this at this point? Okay, I'm going to move on. And so here is that resulting map. And so you'll see kind of less on the eastern side of the district and more kind of on the west. And we know that that's kind of what we expected of where a lot of the population density is in some cases, and a lot of park and trail action on that side too. And then 3 layers going into the infrastructure category. EOR prepared for us a layer with known fire departments, hospitals, places of worship, police stations, schools, electrical substations, wastewater facilities, things like that, like finding those on the map and creating that layer. Creating an emergency routes, using truck routes as a proxy for that. And that truck routes comes from the Minnesota Department of Transportation. So kind of those high priority big roadways that you know, emergency vehicles, fire trucks and ambulances and stuff can use. And then here's all the rest of the roadways, excluding, you know, the really high priority emergency routes, you know, other roadways, which are, you know, important for other reasons and might have greater importance to some people, even if it's not, you know, a big road that a fire truck can drive down. And we found, you know, as expected, you'd think a lot in this area, but, you know, kind of in this, again, western side of it, but also just throughout the district, there's kind of this infrastructure that is present. And finally, we've already been talking about flood hazard, this sort of terrain analysis. But, you know, when we talk about terrain, here are some of the things that we're talking about. And the slope, the curve number, height above nearest drainage, and distance to streams. And so all of that comes together for this flood hazard map. And so those dark orange areas are really the places that we would see water pooling. And then overlay that with the FEMA 100-year floodplain, which is an existing layer, but it isn't, you know, it's not as complete as we would have liked. So you know, you see there is a lot of overlap there with kind of the darker areas, but it's not necessarily all of the areas that might be kind of higher flood hazard based on those criteria that we evaluated. And so here is that. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Can I ask a question on the previous slide? What is a curve number? I know the slope, but what's a curve number?
The curve number is the number that you assign to a soil based on how it
Compact?
will infiltrate the
Oh,
water.
okay.
So impervious surfaces have a curve number of 100% of that water sheds off.
Mhm.
An A-type soil with the right plants has like a 30.
Okay.
So 30% of it runs off in
Gotcha.
effect.
Thank you.
and on this floodplain, the brown one here, so what exactly does that mean? So it looks to me like you're saying that a lot of the streets are gonna be flooded in town. And all the lakes probably are gonna raise up, is that correct, by having them brown? Is
Let me
that,
look at which
I'm
figure.
sorry, That one right there, yeah.
This one right here?
Yeah,
This one is just trying to show that the FEMA 100-year floodplain map, which is what everybody looks at when they're buying a home or getting flood insurance, right? That correlates with our flood hazard layer as it should, right? But what it shows you is that FEMA floodplain boundary is outdated. It's based on older precipitation data. And it's also not complete, right? So the northern part of the watershed district doesn't even have FEMA floodplain boundaries established. So you can just, it's just a way to sort of show you, kind of validates the flood hazard layer, but it shows that the flood hazard layer can be used outside of FEMA to show you similar types of information.
And so then this map is kind of a simplified version, you know, same priority for that whole sub-watershed, reflective of that map. And
You know,
when we
that's-
talk about, oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I was just looking at this, this FEMA 100-year floodplain, the areas that don't have it. Some of that's most of it is in Washington County. That surprises me.
Are you pointing to kind of along the creek system here?
Yeah.
And so it's not brown, so it's not showing up on the flood hazard layer, but the FEMA floodplain map does have that hatching over it because the modeling that was used to establish the FEMA floodplain map is a hydrologic and hydraulic model. So that looks at where you have water backing up in the system. The flood hazard layer is just an analysis of water on the ground. There's no, it's not dynamic.
I see.
It just falls, and then if it pools there, but it doesn't do anything with time.
Sure,
Or how it moves on the landscape.
okay.
Yeah,
Mr. President, do you know how old that map is from FEMA?
I didn't look that data.
Okay.
I could look it up while we're talking.
Just from experience, they don't update those very frequently, so
It's a good gap.
it could be, if they were to redo it, be further expanded based off of the last 20+ years of data, or even just using the Alice 14.
Yes, and they even have a different approach that they recommend, like you do it differently now based on climate change and things like that. So, yeah.
When our first hurricane, they'll update that.
Well, a lot of that has transferred into not open areas, but housing developments.
Mhm.
It's hard to, without some kind of landscape marker, it's hard to judge that, but I'm assuming that this is going into that hatched area into Shallow Pond. So it's right along that corridor, starting in Washington County.
It's about like,
Yeah, so all that Washington County area, where the water would stay there, because that was big wetland area,
Mhm.
is now converting into commercial, big box commercial places. Although those should have on-site treatments that hopefully will hold it and is adequate for what's coming. I just keep looking down there at Little Comfort Lake,
okay, Emily, go ahead, continue.
big swoosh that's coming.
And so kind of these 4 maps that we just previously showed, integrating those all together. EOR did this work for us to get us this map that considers all of these factors that I just presented equally. And then that shows you kind of the red where the highest risk of all these things exists. And so I want to pause on this and maybe take additional questions if people want more information on what goes into these. Do you agree with kind of weighting them equally? Do you want to see it tweaked, or does everyone kind of feel like this map is aligning with you know, the district priorities as they stand?
I guess my opinion, when I was looking through this, is that environmental and flood hazard are the most important. And then the cities, obviously, we don't have infrastructure in the district, so doing the infrastructure would be the city's responsibilities, or counties, and social.
we should
But
think
pardon me?
when we think power stations, those kinds of things, that's infrastructure as well.
Yeah.
They're not in the cities, those are out in the Six,
Well, yeah, but they belong to counties or cities are responsible.
boys, okay.
See what I mean?
See what you're saying.
And so from our perspective, if we take care of the environmental and flood hazard areas, that should be our priority, I think. The reason I say that is because when you have this full integration, all those smaller red places that are in the environment, look at that environmental area, for example. There's hardly anything left of it in the integration model. And that troubles me. And the flood hazard, again, now that's capturing more, flood hazard shows more in that integrated model. But for whatever reason, all of that area in the east and southeast area on the environmental map, there's only a small portion of that that's still showing in the integrated map, and I don't know why that would be.
Can I maybe explain just a little bit here? So the flood hazard layer is just the flood hazard layer on its own.
That's where the water's gonna go.
That's where the water, those are the most vulnerable drainage districts. It might not look like that when you look at the H&H model because you have culverts and you have stormwater improvements and that aren't reflected here. So again, this is a screening tool. The flood hazard plus environmental results in the environmental map. So now you have on the environmental map, what are the drainage districts that have environmental factors and are more vulnerable to flooding showing there. Similarly, it's social and flood hazard on the social, infrastructural and flood hazard on the infrastructural, and the integrated takes all four and puts them all in there. So on the integrated, these are the subcatchments that are at highest risk for environmental, social, infrastructural, and flooding.
Well, how can the infrastructure not be more red? Because that's a downtown area. All of our buildings are there.
So what
so I don't
think it
understand
is,
that.
is it's just a ranking from 1 to 5. So there could be flooding in all of the red and the orange, but we've just ranked them and said, pick the top 5 and the lowest 5, and they're just distributed across that range.
Infrastructure is buildings, all right, and roads and.
Infrastructure is, yep,
Right.
critical infrastructure like hospitals
Hospitals.
and things like that. So while I understand your point that the watershed district is most concerned with environmental and flood hazard, I would just caution you to think about all of that, because if you can address flooding in an area that's also flooding a hospital, you're gonna have more partnership there. The city's going to want to do things, and then you might also benefit from doing something in that area.
Well, the social chart just reflects the population, right? I mean, it's where all the people are, basically.
It
So,
is,
I mean,
yeah.
so that gives a lot of weight, but I mean, so that's a concern because it's flooding where the people are. So as I look at that chart, right? So there is an issue where the population is gonna be impacted fairly greatly, I would think.
Yes, you're going to impact people, there's gonna be impacts to buildings, which impacts people, there's impacts to trails, which impacts people who use the trails to get places. And it has potential impact to drinking water.
Wouldn't that be covered under environmental? Drinking water?
We put drinking water under social because people need water to drink.
And they need,
Yeah.
they get to the stores to buy the food and so forth.
Yeah. So yes, you can certainly move some of these layers to other categories if you would like them organized differently. And then, like Emily said, everything has been weighted equally.
But you know, is there an opportunity to think 3 sigma? I mean, in other words, are there, say, plant communities that are extremely rare
Right.
that we would neglect if we averaged everything out? So what
Yes.
you might look at is the exception rule, where there's certain, in each category, there might be an exception that might get overlooked, but because it's an exception and so important, so Mona Lisa of that species,
Yeah,
we don't wanna lose it, so you do something special to make sure you look at that area?
yeah.
Is that built in, or is that something we have to?
That would be something you'd have to add since everything's equally weighted now.
Well, then somebody, only a plant specialist would be able to tell us that then, oh my God, you gotta protect this area because we got some kind of special mushrooms over there or something that are growing and.
Well, that is why we included the sites of biodiversity significance. To try and pull those really high quality resources out and highlight those.
And that's under environmental,
Yes,
which makes sense. I don't get why drinking water, isn't part of environmental. I don't understand why it's under social. We have that vulnerability map that shows us where the water water that is underground but could be used for drinking water, where those high risk areas are. So if you start developing in those areas, you're at risk of contaminating the drinking water sources underground. So I think that should be up in environmental because it's critical.
I take your point. Mhm.
Well, I guess a question for me on that topic, Mr. President, managers, is, or when you're talking about drinking water, is it private wells or is it the city wells? Because the private wells would be more likely to be impacted by potentially flooding and then.
I'm talking about that top level map that shows the
Mhm.
groundwater sensitivity.
Right,
And that's where water can be taken for public consumption. So protecting that area so that you don't have development. One of the biggest ones is, I don't know if it's on Bixby Park necessarily, but somewhere in that general area, it might be that wetland complex right before it. The ones that we have been looking at over time, last 10 years or so. But that would be on the on the east side, yes, of the freeway. So those two wetlands, the one
Yeah.
that butts. Yeah.
sure.
So, protecting that type of area is what I'm talking about, not the actual wells and all of that.
Oh, so
You know,
the
they,
wellhead protection more, so.
The underground water source for drinking water.
So wellhead protection.
Which is pollution sensitivity of near surface materials, so it's similar. Mhm.
you have a chart that's got numbers on it later on. Maybe we should look at that chart which I didn't understand at all.
I understand.
So that might help us get through out of the woods here.
Yes, maybe. So all of these numbers aren't like number one, number two, number three. Of the reds, which ones kind of came, which ones are in the same bucket? So the one assigned to one was the highest red. The ones that were given a 3 are the one that given a 2 is the next highest red, and the number 3s are all kind of similar, and then the 6s are similar.
Okay, so they have a sensitivity rating, is what you're saying?
In a sense, yeah.
Okay.
One is worst, in terms
One is the highest priority.
of highest priority, which means that it's gonna
Priority.
get it's gonna be,
It seems to be
It's gonna
the
have the most
most
pain.
vulnerable
right.
with all of those factors taken into account.
But if you have the simple solution to this whole thing, seems to me, because there's not much different from the floodplain, so we just go in and fix the floodplain. Watch is what Rice Creek is doing. So why do we have to go through all the rest of it? Because if you control the floodplain, you've controlled all the areas that are gonna be threatened, whether they're social or environmental or not, unless you may have some outlying areas that you gotta look at.
So if we go back to the slide 37, Emily, when you say that, do you mean? Oh, that one, yeah. So when you say floodplain, do you?
Flood hazard.
Flood
Yeah.
hazard, do you mean just address all the red drainage districts in that figure, the flood hazard figure? Is that what you're saying?
Well, they start where the most red is, I mean, downtown and the corridor going down to Comfort Lake. So something has to be done to keep the water from getting in there or storing it somewhere else. So, I mean, that would be an easy solution, maybe, just to look at that problem.
Isn't that kind of what that prior transition number was?
Yeah,
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, you can do everything in the red for sure, but I think like you can't do it all tomorrow. So the
Right.
purpose of the whole exercise is to say, okay, within the red, where do you want to start?
Mhm.
And do you want to start tackling a drainage district that will provide the most benefit across the board? Are there people in these drainage districts that are very sensitive to flooding? And what kind of flooding are they sensitive to? We haven't even talked about that part yet. Do they have flooded basements every time it rains like today? And is that important, or are you worried about a catastrophic event where everybody's calling FEMA?
This is where I kind of go back to this collaborative approach. You know, watersheds are singularly focused local government units. Water, 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 that's it, right? And the environment that impacts the water. But our communities have, partners have all of these other things to worry about, which fall, in my opinion, under the infrastructure and social. And so it's not that it's not gonna get done, but it's going to get done with those partners.
Mhm.
We should not be taking on infrastructure responsibilities that are really the responsibilities of cities, townships, and counties. But what we can do, and what I've heard in the conversations that we had a few years ago with our 10-year plan, when we talked to all the community groups, is that they were very interested in this type of information.
Mhm.
Not for us to do, but for them to do coordinated projects
Mhm.
that enhance the overall end product. And that's where I see the social and infrastructure
Mhm.
being very, very important, is educating them. And we'll take care of the environmental flood hazard stuff, you know, within our boundaries, and then they can use this data to then put together plans, hopefully with our help, just for guidance, if nothing else, to pick up on that infrastructure and social areas with the prioritizations that you've done.
That's gonna be one of the last decisions made, because that's gonna be
Mhm.
after we've had the work sessions and everything else down the road, so. I mean, basically you're saying who's gonna pay for it?
Well,
And
what I'm
so-
saying is responsibility wise, so I don't see it as a last minute thing, I see
Well-
that as a beginning point for the planning.
Well, no, we have to go through it, we have to
Yeah.
identify who's gonna get zapped and who's not gonna get zapped, and then
Mhm.
who is responsible for those areas.
We're identifying need
Right.
right now. And we wanted to look at those other things so that it can be a comprehensive plan.
So I think, I see where you're
Yeah,
coming from,
yeah.
it makes sense, so maybe we should just go on until we have to make some decisions here,
Sure.
if we can't make a decision yet, we're not through everything yet, right, so,
We're close, aren't we?
okay.
May I comment?
Yes, Dave, go ahead, everybody comment now that has a chance, so did we explain those numbers, so everybody knows what the numbers are on that chart? Maybe we should put that chart back up to the one that's the final chart. Yeah, that one.
I'd just like to comment regarding the partnership discussion as we look at private industry playing a role in this partnership. We need to consider that as well. If you look at where Martin Marietta's gravel pit is located, it's right in the middle of a floodplain and it's outside our watershed district. However, they're using millions of gallons from our aquifer and cleaning their product and just shuffling it into ponds. You know, that's an area where we need to consider too, larger private companies and the role that they are going to play if there is a flood.
Where is that related to, Bone Lake,
West,
Dave?
just to the west.
Is it?
You have a pointer, Emily? Yeah, there we are right there. Thank you.
Okay.
So yeah, and you know, what we're finding is that they have dredged down below the bottom of Bone Lake to access gravel and then using water at the approval of the DNR, millions of gallons of water. So I mean,
Wow.
this is something too that I think we need to bring to light as we work with partners to bring them into the conversation and say, you know, are you aware of this? What are your plans?
Yeah, that's a good point, because Keewatin, it's much closer to Keewatin, it looks like, than Bone. But
No, it's closer to home.
is it?
Yeah.
Okay, well, it's just off a little bit, I suppose, on this map, but
I think that's a great example of what this map doesn't have, right? This screening tool just includes data layers that we know about, right? And can intersect in a way that makes sense, like statistically to compare these to each other. But that type of information, you know, is missing from the map. Like cultural resources to a community wouldn't be on a map. So
Sure.
when you go out to the community and to the public and share this and get their feedback, it would be nice to have a layer of points that are significant.
Yes, landmarks,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely,
Yeah.
I agree.
That gravel pit is right across the road from that farmstead on the southwest Bowman project,
Oh,
right across
okay.
there. So
Yeah,
it's
it doesn't
big,
look that close
there's
on
a
this
huge
map.
embankment there that blocks all view of that place.
Sure, okay.
Camilla, the other question I had is that everything's organized around our watershed boundaries, but as you know, most of the city and a lot of population and buildings and everything else is right in that lower southeast corner in Rice Creek. So it seems to me that, I mean, no water's gonna go down there, right? We know that's not true, because that's a low area, right? That's gonna be flooded like crazy down there.
Yeah,
So how can we work on this and not take care of that area, even though it's not in our area? Shouldn't Rice Creek be part of this in terms of taking care of most of the population is there in terms of?
absolutely. I would invite the watershed districts, the neighboring watershed districts, and share this with them as part of your planning process.
Because someone is gonna be really upset when we've protected all the people in our area, but then across the street and City Hall floats down to Clear Lake. They're not gonna be real happy about that.
Right, yeah, agreed.
So,
One watershed.
Right.
project.
Right, Mr. President, I think
Yeah.
even on the infrastructure
Right.
piece in particular, when we talk to partners, right, we don't know exactly what's comprises critical, you know, I mean, the municipalities or partners may have a different view about what is the most important thing to
Mhm.
protect. And of course, like 61, right, traverses through Rice Creek and Comfort Lake, Forest Lake. So I think that part, and so while I guess I would suggest that, while we may say we're gonna work on the environmental and flood hazard, the reality is that there's some of these are gonna be overlapping
Mhm.
and, you know, to have a collaborative, you know, maybe the county has more ability to make a request from the federal government through other,
That's my point, that's my point exactly,
okay,
because we don't have any responsibility for infrastructure or social aspects by law. We are blinders.
but you know, if we do, the same project could impact all 4 areas.
Well, of course it could,
Yeah.
of course it could, but we don't
So
want,
maybe then they should share in that cost then too.
that's what I'm saying, I've been saying.
well,
So,
I'm just concerned that.
I'll just keep saying it.
But the language sounds like that's your problem, not ours, but it's a shared, so.
I qualified all of that,
Okay, yeah, just
I qualified all of
making
that.
sure that.
They missed that too.
And the technical, well, you know, that's my point, is that we're doing this technical plan or report that's inclusive of all of those things. But we don't have responsibility for that under statute. That's not our area that has been designated to us by the legislature. And so we can do what we can do, and we want to encourage them to do these other projects. And if we combine them, then we have a better chance of getting these big Lessard Sams and this climate bill that I'm really anxious to see come out of the legislature this year, and all of those things. But they're going to be responsible for their own, you know, part in the plan.
Okay.
We can get the money for them. We can provide all that technical support.
So the next step was to do some modeling. So do we need to hear that before we can make some, to see kind of where this is going and what's required to help us make some decisions?
What do you think, Emily? What were the next slides?
Yeah, it was mostly just kind of asking these questions of, you know, so yes, modeling next. But before we move on to that next one, are we all kind of on the same page about, you know,
Okay,
should we
I see
start
what
with that integrated map as it stands to decide where to model, or you know, there's talk of shifting these priorities, that'll change what that integrated map looks like. Do you want to see what that new integrated map would look like and then pick where you want to start modeling?
And the next step, when we say see where you wanna look at the modeling, right? So screening level tools, say you pick a priority sub watershed. Our next thing would be, okay, what does your model look like in that drainage district? Does it need to be refined? Is it gonna tell us what we want to know given where you picked? Right? Do we need to make it a higher resolution model in order to be able to articulate what the flooding is and what the solutions might be?
Okay, so first of all, you've talked about catchments in there, and you've talked about sub watersheds, and you got those numbers up there. So I got three different areas in my mind right now. So which ones are we talking about?
Interchangeably, I apologize. Catchments, sub watersheds, the boundaries that you see on this figure.
So those numbers are sub watersheds also?
Yes.
Okay,
So for example, if number one was addressed aggressively and got something for mitigation there, would that maybe push twos and threes to threes and fours?
Good, yes, because it's upstream of the rest of the system, which would be a reason to pick something higher in the drainage district.
Going with flow.
Going with the flow.
Exactly. It's all about the flow.
so we're just chasing phosphorus in a different form.
Well, it's not
That's
just
another
phosphorus.
benefit
Not
of
just
everything.
phosphorus, yeah. Well, and that's, again, I want to ask you though about, when you had the 4 maps up, you said that environment includes floodplain, right?
Yes,
So is it an integrated map for those two? When you get to
Yes.
environment?
yeah,
Okay, so that always includes floodplain, actually, all 4 of those include the floodplain. Then why would we have
Flood
such
risk.
different markings? I mean, why do we lose 2 points on the floodplain map when we integrate it all? If it's part of every one.
maybe I'm misspeaking, and maybe it is just those are the ones with the environmental pieces in it. These are
Mhm.
with the social, and then when you
That-
integrate them, they look like this.
That's what makes more
Okay,
sense. to me.
Yeah, I think I misspoke. Thank
Yeah.
you for clarifying
Sure.
that.
Can you go to that one that shows the 4?
Slide
and then-
37.
Okay.
This one?
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about there. That makes more sense to me.
So you'll see area number 1 is in all 4 of those.
Mhm.
So
No social impact by Moody?
So would you repeat again, Camilla, what the next step is for you?
Well, based on this conversation, maybe the next step would be, like Emily said, to pull the drinking water, the pollution sensitivity of near surface material off of the social and onto the environmental scoring.
I think that was me.
What,
Yeah,
what is the standard though? How's that treated in other areas? So we don't go one direction just for us.
this is all just for you. I mean, it's up to you. There is no standard approach that other people are taking.
Okay.
Rice Creek didn't do this approach. So you can share this with Rice Creek and then they will, you know, they might want to weigh in on that decision, or you might want to ask them if they want to weigh in on that decision before. Or the communities, Emily and I did share all this information with the Forest Lake in Wyoming. And they thought it seemed fine and didn't have any thoughts about prioritizing or changing the ranking.
Did you talk about the collaborative nature of what we want to achieve
Yeah,
and their responsibility for things?
I didn't.
You didn't talk about that, okay.
Responsibility, no.
I think before we go too far down a path, we should talk to it would be their engineering firms, correct? Okay, that would be the first step.
Yeah, they have engineering staff.
Yeah. I think that makes sense. But we have to have a clear vision of what we want to do so that they understand it.
Well, and we did do that.
Right, my
But I
president,
meant changing.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not sure, Mr. President, if city councils would want their engineers to speak on behalf of the
Well,
council.
I was gonna say, you're talking to the wrong audience when you ask that question, because the engineers are gonna give you a technical answer. And the city council has to make a money decision, they're gonna get involved with change these things around.
Right.
So, but I think if, but we could put the information together and they can make that decision, well, they don't wanna go up after it, we're not gonna do the work for them, obviously, right? So they have to make that decision, but if they don't have the information, they can't even make the decision.
Right.
So we're just giving everybody an opportunity to make this a better place to live in the
I
next.
think all of
4
our
years.
communities too, with the exception of maybe Chisago Township, are split. I mean, we only have only a portion of the district. Excuse me, only a portion of the city is part of the district.
Right, so did we answer Emily's questions first round? She wanted some agreement on the board before we go to modeling, so are we all comfortable with going with the combined chart then? Equal weighting? That was one of the questions, I believe, right? Equal weighting?
That was one of the questions, and what, I'm hearing from Jackie is say, lower the rating, not equal, lower social and infrastructural, and move, the pollution sensitivity of near surface materials out of social and into environmental.
That's correct. That's what I would like to see.
I don't see how we can divorce infrastructure.
Why is that? Because you wanted to work on those areas or include it in the environmental, which is one of our areas of responsibility, right?
Absolutely. Surface water and groundwater, that's what we're responsible for. So it shouldn't be a social issue. It should be our responsibility.
Well, what does the board think about
And
that
I'm
logic?
talking about protecting the access to the aquifers, basically.
Right.
Not,
Not leaving it up to the city.
yes, exactly. Not leaving it up to the city.
So that to me makes sense in
Yes.
the logic of what our mission is. and everything else.
Absolutely, the
So, and
logic
you've
of
been
our
here the
mission.
longest, so I don't know, does everybody understand what Jackie's saying then, and how do you feel about that? Mike?
I don't see how you can take any of them out. Infrastructural, yeah, they have their own liabilities and responsibilities, but if we don't control the water in the area and it starts to inundate the infrastructural issues, they can't do anything on their own except build a dike around a power plant. But
But that's not the point, I think. Doug, I think Jackie's point is that we're responsible for certain things.
mhm,
And if we're responsible for groundwater and it's up to, and that falls in an infrastructure area and the city's mainly responsible for infrastructure, they may not care about groundwater, or not do much about it. And if we may lose our groundwater capability, which is in our charter.
mhm.
So we're just, I think what Jackie's saying, let's keep everything in our charter,
Well, but to his point is that the road construction can go on, but they have to get permits from us to do it. And that's where our rules come into play and say, but you have to do all of this. You've got to meet this criteria. So it's not like we're not doing it. We're laying the roadmap for what needs to be done, but it's that community's responsibility, not ours.
Mike?
President Manager, so the city's, I think, response on the groundwater piece is that they do have a legal responsibility from wellhead protection standpoint.
Mhm.
They are required to have that for every municipal well that they have, so.
Right, just like they protect the trees.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, there's a bigger consequence.
Right,
If we lose our wells.
but all of you are using the roads and other infrastructure, so. So I think that, so while the integrated one comes up with the, 1 to 5, has all those other ones. I think if, just from being the technical resource to our LGUs in this particular topic. Then I think that maybe what we could do is also then have some combined, so maybe you're gonna take of the 4. You might say, okay, well, we wanna look at flood hazard and infrastructure, what would the top 5 look on that one? And then at least offer to them Because if I was on the other side and they came in and said, well, here's our top 5 that we're only concerned about for flood hazard and environmental. And now you could figure out what infrastructure looks like. I wouldn't be very happy on, from a partner standpoint versus saying that these are the different ones that, come in from the standpoint of saying flood hazard and infrastructure, the top 5 would be this. There's gonna be some overlap of those various combinations of subs of these 4 mappings. And then at least presenting that information in a collaborative effort to say, here are the ones that we would look at. And of course, through all of those, there's gonna be some level of opportunistic, just, these are gonna be less expensive. These are, maybe there's a single landowner, like the current situation with Bone Lake. If we're to get that property, we could do a lot of benefit, not only to the Bone Lake residents, but to Lofton Avenue, so infrastructure, some combination like that. So that would be my recommendation. If we're not gonna use the one fully integrated one, setting the top 5 priorities, and at least look at the other ones and in some level of combinations, and then come back to that for final discussion.
Well, I just pulled up the statute, 103D.201, watershed district purposes, subdivision 1. General purpose is to conserve the natural resources of the state by land use planning, flood control, and other conservation projects by using sound scientific principles for the protection of the public health and welfare and the provident use of natural resources. The establishment of watershed districts is now authorized under this chapter. And then it goes through, but that's the statement. So that's what we're responsible for. And we can, and just as you said, and I've said before, is that one of those responsibilities is to being the technical resource to our partners. We don't have to do their projects, but we have to have them understand what doing this project in their area means toward clean water and flood correction and so forth. So
Yeah, I think we want to show all the top priorities as they are with all these things. It's just a question though, when it gets down to who's gonna work on what, then everybody has a slightly different perspective. Groundwater may be low on the city infrastructure thing, but it might be high in our area because we're responsible for it. So, it might be 17th on theirs, but it might be number 5 on us. So I think we still want to do the best job we can to represent an objective view of what's really out there. Mike, go ahead.
Camilla, would you readily be able to do the top 5 on the rank for the other individual maps?
Similar to what we had for the previous
For
one?
the integrated, right?
Yeah, I can't give it to you today.
No, but that's fine, but
Yes.
But it wouldn't take another
No, it wouldn't
effort,
take-
you've already,
no.
yeah, so
Yeah.
that might be helpful.
Oh, that's
What are we
good.
talking about, the top
I
5?
see what you're saying. That would be a good idea. So individual prioritization by environment, by flood hazard, right? Okay,
Mhm.
Right.
and the other 2 as well.
And that number 1 comes up in all 4 of the other maps.
Mhm.
Yeah.
District.
So what,
Yeah.
we're talking about the numbers on
Yeah,
so you
The
do numbers for each
prioritization.
area,
Yeah.
okay.
But right now, we only have it for the one integrated,
right.
and
Correct, yeah.
so this is.
Well, that's even better,
Yeah,
taking
we
it to
did
the
it.
cities with priorities listed for social and infrastructure. Once you take out groundwater, of course, but.
So these are priorities of
But what's
watersheds, right,
No,
or
that's
sub-watersheds,
perfect.
right?
Mhm.
Correct, but by individual layer, so for the environmental, which of those in that map, for the environmental map, which of those are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5?
Right.
And then for infrastructure, which ones are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5?
That's what I was saying earlier in the meeting where I was saying we got this unique mushroom out there, it wouldn't show up on the integrated chart, but it might be very high in the environmental one, right?
Yeah.
Mhm.
So, or biodiversity, wherever it fits, I don't know.
Yeah, so each section gets prioritized.
And then from that standpoint, if we're meeting with the LGUs on the infrastructure one, we could say, well, here's the number 1 within your community area.
Mhm.
How would you like to, would you like to pay EOR to run the model, or have your own engineering firm run the model? Just we can presumably give it to them, right?
Yeah, and that's an interesting thing because Emily and I discovered that, the city of Forest Lake is updating their model and they're taking their model to a very nice resolution, like they can look at individual blocks. So it wouldn't make sense to have you
Right,
have us update your model when they have their model and they like their model better. So that would be a next step. Once you picked your area, we would tell you if that's even one that we would recommend
Mhm.
moving forward with, or just waiting till the cities are done.
You know, our WANK study, our foundational study, putting the district together, gets down to that level. You know, by the. Oops, sorry, yeah, you know, by that, smallest catchment basin, which is typically in a neighborhood. So have you looked at that at all to see if that has any help for this study?
I haven't, and I can
Okay.
ask Cecilia and Greg.
Okay,
I leave the modeling to them.
we have that data, that's the point of it all, so.
But I do recall that they did not have any, nearly the extent of,
It may not be to the resolution that we have, but. Yeah.
well, but also just the inventory work. The city, you know, until recent years, we did not
Oh,
have
the
that.
city, yeah.
Well, it sounds we may have
The
pushed the
culverts.
button over there for them to spend money on that.
Yes,
Right? That's, I mean, that's a really significant step for the city to spend money on
yeah,
that, so.
Yeah.
So they must have more than just a passing interest rate. They thinking we're gonna do it for them, because they're gonna be doing their own capability, right?
Well, a lot of cities have these same concerns, right? Like,
Right.
this is a liability to the cities if they're not planning for climate change now. So a lot of
Right.
communities are updating their models, investing in improving and maintaining their storm sewer infrastructure, and then figuring out how to plan. But a lot of cities are looking at how to make it bigger and how to move it downstream out of their city. So that's the
Exactly.
role of the watershed district.
Exactly right.
How can we?
That's what I'm saying,
coordinate?
Comfort Lake can't take anymore.
That's what Madison did to us.
So I think we have some next steps, like Emily said, we can move from social to environmental, we can give you the top 5 individually and in the integrated. And then you can look at that and say, if you have a recommendation or if you want to take that to the communities.
I think that's a good first step.
I do. What do you think, Emily?
So if we pick a watershed and you do some work on it, what's gonna come out of that now? Again, just the specific projects or?
So if we looked at a watershed more closely, we said this one seems to be really vulnerable for these reasons. We would look at the model and run the current 100-year. I would recommend running a series of rainfall events, a 2, a 10, a 25-year, under a future climate scenario to say, when do we start to see flooding? What kind of flooding is it? And then who's sensitive to that flooding, right? It might be some parts of the city are flooding for a 10-year event and their roads are overtopping and getting into a school parking lot, which makes it hard for kids. That might be something that the city wants to address, right? The watershed district might not want to, but the solution might be something that benefits the watershed district and the city.
Mhm.
So being able to look at it more closely and say, what are the problems? When is it a problem? And what are the solutions?
Okay,
And we've done that in the past. I
Yeah.
mean, when Broadway was changed and that circle thing was put in, the park was flooding. The watershed district said, let's add some water quality benefits to this project. County's on board, the city's on board, and that's what happened. So that's why the park over here is dry now. It used to be wet after a storm. And so we've done that for the city before. And this is, you know, in that piecemeal way, we didn't have all of the infrastructure maps that we needed. But by working with them on every project, even before we had rules, they were bringing every project within the district to us, and our engineers and our administrator were looking at them and making sure that the intended rules that we were working on were met. So we've done that with the city before. It's not something new. We have, I think, some real buy-in, especially from some of the bigger commercial areas that have taken the step of putting underground stormwater collection points. This third one came in behind Walmart, and I think that wasn't that a car lot that property we were looking at and we didn't like it, and And they came in and bought that and then put, their auto store there and they put in one of those underground treatments, because there wasn't enough room to do a surface one. So, you know, I think the city's working with us on that and taking some ideas even from the beginning. So I don't think this is gonna be a big lift. I think they're gonna look at it with open arms and open minds, and we're gonna end up with a good product, collaborative product. Okay,
So
good.
if I could just recap the next steps. So Camilla had said we're gonna move that pollution sensitivity of near surface materials from social into environmental. Give that 1 through 5 ranking on each of these maps, not, it's only integrated right now. And then she said that the communities, and I want to clarify what that means, taking it to the communities. So we've already had a meeting with me, Camilla, and the city engineers for Scandia, Wyoming, and Forest Lake. Is that kind of take it back to that same group, or was there something else in mind with taking that to the communities?
I would recommend doing it the way you did it before. Talk to the engineering staff. They've had contact with us before. This is a slight variation from maybe what they heard before. And then after that, schedule the meetings with the boards and councils at their recommendation.
Well, they're gonna look to their own people for a recommendation too,
Yeah,
right? So
Well,
that's
they're
why you
gonna-
need to go to them first, yeah.
yes, the engineering firm, yes.
So I'm hearing hold a joint city council and maybe a series of joint city council watershed board meetings. So with Wyoming, Scandia, Forest Lake primarily, so 3 special board meetings before we embark on any further community engagement. Is that what the kind of the direction I'm hearing?
No, it's do those priority maps, make that one change for water to come under environmental instead of social, drinking water. And what did you call it? You had that long name for it.
Yeah, sensitivity.
Yeah, exactly. Bring that over to environmental, I mean, and then do your priority mapping for each one of them independent of each other. And then the next steps, and we'll see that first, and then we can talk again about refining the next steps. But what we were just talking about is going to the engineering firms for each of our community members that you've already contacted to give them, you know, whatever the final change is gonna be here after we see that priority mapping. And then let them tell us if it needs to go before a full board. We can certainly do that. But typically, the engineers will give reports on their activities, and one of them will be a continuation of the meetings with the Comfort Lake Association, excuse me, this Comfort Lake, Forest Lake Watershed District, excuse me. And so they update their council members that way, and the council will decide whether they want to see us, you know, at a
Right,
meeting.
right.
Yeah.
Dave, do you have any thoughts? Chris, I don't know whether you're still on or not.
Yes, I'm in agreement with the direction we're heading in. I like the idea of moving the drinking water from social to environmental. I do have a concern. Emily, can we go back to the slide at the beginning where you broke down the social categories? There's some language there that I think we need to be sensitive to, where it talks about English speaking. This is not the slide. It's a slide that talked about, oh, there it is. I'm sorry, it is there.
There it is.
Rather than persons who speak English less than well, we should change that language to be more sensitive, to read something like English is not primary or first language. I think
Yeah.
that's being more sensitive to people in that area.
Category, yeah.
Yeah,
Speak English as a second language.
where English isn't a primary, yeah. I think the way he said it was right.
Good catch, Dave, thanks.
As we move forward with this, I think it's important that we have be sensitive to different groups of people in the social category, and yeah. I think that says it.
Message received. Yeah, that was a good catch.
Anybody else? I guess Chris is off, huh? Can I?
He's muted, or he can't
Mm.
unmute himself, but he said he agreed.
Okay, that's fine. Good.
Can I ask for clarification? So what do you want city staff to ask city council? If they, what their priority subcatchments would be? Or will you have a recommendation that you want us to review with city staff? And that they would review with their city council?
Yeah, and that's what we talked about. You have to bring us back a priority.
Yep.
By each of these separate areas.
Yep.
And then the message about this change, if it is a change from what you told them before, has to be relayed. And then, that conversation has to take place, and then they should tell us whether or not they can relay that message to the cities, or they want us to do it.
And then the message is, do they agree with that ranking? Do they agree with these being priority?
Yeah, I guess.
Okay.
They would have to. You said they're working on their own? All of the
Or-
city engineers?
Or license. So,
They're working on their model, but which sub-watershed or sub-watersheds do they think the watershed district should focus on first, is what you're asking the cities, right?
I'm not sure that's the question, no. So we would have a quarterly meeting coming up, and then I can chat with Emily a little bit more on this, for Scandia and Wyoming. And we typically have their engineer at those meetings, and so we can talk also with the administrators, and such. It's presenting it because it's not really a debate, because this is, you're using the scientific basis for the layers and saying, this is what we find. And so, from our perspective, the environmental and flood hazard are the ones we would want to prioritize. But we're open to collaboration for these other ones in the social and the infrastructure. So, and we may want to think about how many. So if we did some different combinations,
Mhm.
2s and 3s, in addition to the whole integrated one, all 4. I don't know how many different maps that would comprise, but I could imagine people asking, well, what would it look like under these two, this scenario? Social and environmental, or social and infrastructure, for example. You combine those two, so. And then at some point, because for us, the question would be, to them, in my opinion, would be to, how do you want to handle addressing the things that are most vulnerable to your community members, for your infrastructure, and how can we help facilitate that protection without us necessarily taking the lead? Would that be correct from what I'm understanding from?
Well, I think it is correct, but I think that we're kind of jumping the gun a little bit. We have to see this new priority
Mhm.
by area first and see what it actually means to each of the communities. Maybe having EOR break down by community where these projects would be, so that we have a little bit more, like we were talking about, definition of where those maps actually are. They're located.
Putting municipal boundaries on.
Yeah,
on here would be
municipal
good, right?
boundaries, yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. And then we have a better idea
Okay.
of what we're talking about. But I think that, the stepped way, which is what we've been talking about in different ways, I think everybody's thinking the same thing, and maybe just is phrasing it a little bit differently. But we should talk about this, I think, after we look at these new maps, because I think it'll just come into focus for everybody at that point.
Yeah.
And the conversations are gonna be no different than what you've had with the engineering firms to this date. They can act on it or not act on it. We're gonna take care of the floodplain and the environmental issues as far as we can. But if it involves some infrastructure changes, then obviously we've got to work with the cities and so on. So we have to be flexible with that statement. But yeah, and the social issues would be their responsibility. Again, if we're doing one of our projects in a particular area and they want to do theirs, because it would be more convenient and probably cost effective to combine those things, then we can do that. We can get joint grants for each of these things. That's gonna mean a lot to the cities. So we're gonna provide support.
Sounds good. That's great. Thank you.
Okay, Emily, anything else you want to cover or Camilla? No? Okay.
I think that's good. We'll work on those things we talked about and we'll report back and maybe look at having the workshop number 2 with the board here in late May or early June. And I'm not sure if we have enough of a sense of that timeline right now to look at schedules, but I'll send out another scheduling poll and we'll find a date that works for everyone.
If we could do it in early June, that would be great. My May is really packed.
Emily, kudos on organizing this. I really liked where you had a slide that identified outcomes. That's helpful. And so as we go forward, if you could do that further.
Yeah,
continue
I
to-
agree. That was helpful. Yeah, very good.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
One last question for Camilla. So when you bring this back, are you going to show us that graphically, those changes that occur when you put in the different quotients for rain events and so forth? I mean, do we have that H&H modeling at the point where we can actually see it graphically?
No,
Okay,
I don't think we do.
okay.
I think that's the next step after you identify where you want to focus.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right,
All right, so no other questions. I'll take a motion to adjourn.
so moved.
Second,
I'll second.
thank you. So I'll do a roll call vote. Manager Anderson,
Yes.
Doug,
Yep.
Dave
Aye.
and Chris.
Aye.
And Manager Schmaltz, aye. So we're adjourned then, and it's about 5:45, 4:45.
Yeah.
All right, good.
Nice.
Nice meeting.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Yep, thanks everybody. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Emily.